let's get into it. So today we have the opportunity to learn from Keerti. I think he may have, no, he's still here.
I'm here. I had some problem with the camera though. I started well, but then it faded off. I don't know.
Okay.
Probably I'll just go with the audio then.
All right. And
I can restart, but I don't want to waste time on it.
Do you need to share your screen?
Yeah, I need to share my screen. I'll go ahead.
That works perfect. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing and you can go ahead. I had your bio here. Let me see if I can pull that up again.
Can you see my screen?
I don't know. I still have my presentation up. Yes, we can see your screen. So let me go ahead and introduce you for everyone, unless you wanted to do that part, Keerti.
I'm okay the best. I have one slide. I can do it. But yeah, I'm okay the best.
All right. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, let me jump into it. Today's topic, working with progressive web apps, building progressive web apps with Angular, calling it PWA Cookbook. So I'll jump into the agenda. I have the introduction slide in a moment. So this is in a way continuation to what we did in back in December. So wanted to take few use cases and explain building Angular applications that work offline as well as irrespective of the network conditions on a slow network in scenarios like that. So to begin with, we'll introduce what is a service worker. Anyone coming into the meetup for the first time who hasn't got a chance to attend the session back in December. If you're new to service workers, it could be a good introduction. We'll take an example of a demo application, a small sample with a couple of pages that I have. Will demonstrate the features using that application. So I'm planning to talk about prefetching the application. This largely talked about in the session back in December. We'll look at the scenarios: cache first, network first, stale while revalidate. These three aspects we'll try to jump in as detailed as possible. Having said that, I'm Keerti Kotaru. I work out of Hyderabad, India. So I've been a regular contributor to NG Hyderabad, which is an AngularJS Hyderabad meetup group. I used to be quite active a couple of years back. I had to travel. I moved out of Hyderabad for a couple of years. Then it has been trying to pick up again, pick up pace with AngularJS Hyderabad meetup group again. Having said that, there is a pretty good group here, good number of people maintaining, attending, as well as presenting AngularJS sessions in Hyderabad, India. So these are my social handles. I'm quite active on Twitter. Feel free to follow me if you're looking for JavaScript content in general. I've also been fortunate enough to share my knowledge by authoring 3 different books, the latest being the Building Offline Applications with Angular. This has been pretty recently published. This is a quick intro about myself. We'll move on. We'll give a quick introduction to Service Worker. Anyone who is new to Service Worker, you would look at the Service Worker as a process running in the browser. We could look at it as a separate thread running in the browser. It is always running process, even when the application is not open. So when we launch the web application, Service Worker acts as a proxy. Any network requests, get, post, put, delete, primarily get, not post, put, delete, but primarily the get calls go through the Service Worker. It gives us an opportunity to use the cache. We could decide to load the application content. When you make a get call, you could load from the cache in the browser using the Service Worker, or you could go to the network and fetch the data and show the latest information. This gives the flexibility with the network. If you're disconnected, if you're slow on the network, you still have an opportunity to use your application in those scenarios. Yeah, I mean, a couple of points we already discussed. It's always running in the browser. It decreases the dependency on the network. It is installable. It makes the web applications install on our machines, be it a laptop or a phone or a tablet device like iPad. It's a quick life cycle. If you go to an application, a lot of applications of late, Medium I could think of, even AngularJS documentation. There are quite a number of applications today that are using service worker already. If you go to the application for the first time on a particular machine or on a device, you would see the service worker register for the first time. It happens in the background. If there is an error, it attempts to do it next time around when you refresh the page. If it is activated, then it starts working as a proxy. Any fetch call, it gives us an opportunity as a developer to get it from the cache or get it from the network, depending on the use case. It's a quick life cycle. Some of it is a little bit of repetition. I'll try to move as fast as possible. So service worker configuration, we have, in the last session, we looked at largely the grayed out areas where we looked at how the application is installable. You could have all your resources, be it the scripts, the HTML pages, images, font, etc. could be assets and resources that could be cached using the asset groups configuration. And I can also show this in this code sample. It might make a lot of sense, but then data groups, how we use the data groups. I'm not showing each and every field, but these four, I think, have a critical role to play. So I just highlighted four of them, which we'll get into the details in a moment. Yeah, so this is the sample application. Let me jump in. Yeah, here I have a sample app. This is installed. It is a browser application. Hopefully I have the code running. Let me just ensure my code is running. Yeah, code is running. So I could launch this in a new tab. Let me bring this window here. Yeah, this particular application, this is installable. I already installed it. That's what you see here, which is the pre-cache aspect of it, which we looked at in detail in the December session, where I have an installed application here. So I could launch it. This can happen on a mobile device as well. So I have just a couple of pages. It's a simple application for demo purpose. I could click on one of these. This is a web arcade. There are a bunch of board games. You can click on a particular board game. You would see few details about it. Any comments that users might have added, you can add a comment. This is the application. We will get into the details in a bit. Yeah, so prefetch, as I said, these are the resources that let it, this is everything for everything in the application except the data. All the images, font, the scripts, the JavaScript that shows us the application, the HTMLs, everything put together. That configuration, that's what we see here. A bunch of these JS files, CSS files, index.html, even the assets, including images, font files, etc. I'll show the entire configuration at one shot. So one of the use cases that we could see, cache first. Let me go to the application and let's see what we have here. If you're building an Angular application, and if you add the service worker schematic, it's at Angular/PWA. If you install it, if you do that ng add, at Angular/PWA, you should see a bunch of configurations, other module files, etc., being added to your project. At that point, this is an important configuration that matters for us. These are the configurations I was showing in the slide earlier. So in the data group, let me begin with configuration for performance. Let me restart this. I'll build it. I'll build the application. So one aspect when we are working with progressive web apps, last I have seen, when we do ng-serve, the service worker doesn't install yet. We would have to deploy it on a separate web server. It could be as simple as something like HTTP server, which runs on a different port. If it is local host, ideally we need to have a certificate, and it has to be a valid certificate for progressive web apps and service workers to be installed on the browsers. I mean, if you deploy on a remote server, be it cloud like AWS or Azure, you would have to have a certificate. If it is a HTTP connection, it doesn't work, except for local host, which is an exception for development purposes. So what am I running here? Just a sec. Yeah. So I'm running the HTTP server here, localhost 8080. That's where is this application. Give me just a sec. One more build. If I come back to the application here, gather the, yeah, refresh this window. We made a change. So this code sample has the code to identify there has been a code change and reinstall the application. A typical web application, you refresh it there, but progressive web app being an installable app, you would have to reinstall the application, which happens automatically in the background. You probably have to do one couple of refreshes because it has to identify that there is a new app available on the server, and it reinstalls it in the browser for you in the background. So I just want to show something here. I'm getting the data from a mock server. So if I go to the mock server here, let me open that server. I wantedly introduced a 6 seconds delay. So if I go to the browser, localhost 3000 board games, it won't load instantly. I mean, it's all localhost. Ideally, it should just load, but I introduced that delay to showcase a slow network connection. Imagine it takes time for the web server to get the data for you, or even if there is a network slowness. But when I refresh the application, you could see, because we have configured performance here in the service worker configuration for the Angular application here, NGSW configuration, we configured for performance. So it's pretty much using the cache. As we were saying in the slide here, it is cache first. It gets the data from the cache. Only if the cache is not available, it goes to the network. If I completely uninstall and try to launch the application, if you observe first time when I ran it, it took a minute. It took a second or so. But next time onwards, if I come here, even though I introduced a delay on the web server, you still see the application load, and I'm doing the refresh here. Just instantly loads because it's coming from the cache. That is the cache first performance option. But your data is going to be stale quite soon. So I have age of this cache set to 24 hours. You could set to anything here. So in few scenarios, it could be minutes. In few other scenarios, it could be days. It's just an arbitrary number, 24 hours in the sample. So we instantly loaded the application, even though the service is slow. Let's look at the other cases. Initial value we had here was freshness. There's the other configuration that I could have. Let me save this, close this, build it again. I think the sample I have to move to 13. I'm still probably on 11 or something. Refresh the application again. As you see, the code sample here identifies there is a new version of the service worker. It gives an option for the user to install the new version. User can continue with the current version. That's something we might do in our apps because user could be in middle of something. We don't want them to lose the workflow. Give them a prompt that they can install the new app. So let me bring up the dev tools side by side. So we have the new one available. Remember, we have 6 seconds delay on the board games API, this particular API that we are looking at. I'll refresh this. If you see, the data has come back, but board games is still pending on the network. Why is this happening? Let me just show the picture. It's easy to understand with the picture, I guess. Network first, we want to go to the network, but if the network resource is taking too long, then we can go to the cache. That is the idea. What we are looking at, what I'm showcasing here in the second sample is network first. You go to the network first. The network is unavailable, or if it is slow, we are coming to the cache. If I go back to the configuration for a sec, you see the timeout, I set it to 2 seconds. If it's if the service is taking more than 2 seconds to respond, it's going to take it from the cache. Whereas we introduced in the service 6 seconds delay. So obviously it's going to load from the cache. So, in a real world scenario, maybe the service is going to come back 80-90% of the times within the 2 seconds or 3 seconds that you are any arbitrary configuration you might have. But then if there is a delay, you would get it from the cache, and user experience is good because your user is not waiting indefinitely for the data to come back. This is one more use case I wanted to demonstrate. One more interesting one, stale while revalidate. So let me do something. If you look at the data here, we have these games list. I have a test game here. Let me go back to this is just a mock service. So all I'm doing is picking it from a file and returning that data in an Express server, in an Express service. So let me get rid of this. Let me restart the Express API. Come back. Open the network. I have gotten rid of this test game now. You still see the test game. In this scenario, as we have seen so far, it's stale data because it's coming from the cache. In this example, I've manually introduced 6 seconds delay. So it's always going to time out and it's going to get it from the cache. But eventually, once the response comes back, you see that particular object that we got rid of, that test data, is gone. It's not there anymore. This also updated the cache. Next time you refresh, you should see that record gone. It could happen that some records are modified, some records are added, some records could be deleted. Whatever it is, it loads from the cache instantly, but it could be stale data. But if you refresh it second time, you should be up to date. These are generic use cases doesn't matter in the game list, but I think in our applications, we have to pick and choose based on the use case. There could be some scenarios where it's absolutely not acceptable that stale data is shown. Then we won't take this approach. We would have to let the user wait in those scenarios. But wherever it's okay for the user to see a little bit old data, I think we can take this approach. So yeah, I talked about the configurations. Freshness is what tries to go to the network first. If there is a timeout, it goes to the cache. We looked at the other configuration where it is performance priority, which means it loads from the cache all the time till it expires. Once the cache expires, then I think a lot of static content from content servers, this makes a lot of sense, where once in a day or so you could have the updated data. Meanwhile, you could always get it from the cache. It's a better user experience. Having said that, this is the browser support for service worker. These are quite popular, as we were talking about it a few minutes ago. Almost every modern browser has it. Internet Explorer, I think it's obsolete now with Edge and Picture. So Microsoft Edge and Picture. So yeah, so all major browsers support it. This is what I have planned for demo. I think we were looking at this particular code change, which is every time you rebuild, if there is a newer version of the application available, identifying and how to verify that there is a newer version of the application and publish or install the newer version of the application in the browser. That happens with this available. I can just show it in the code rather. I just put it in an Angular service. So this is actually this particular property is moving out. I think we should be using, as I have shown in this slide, I would have to update the code sample. I would have to change to check for update. But for the moment, I have a little older function, which is if it is available, it'll check if it is available. If it is available, I'm showing the snack bar with a message, a new version of the application is available. And then if user chooses to reload, then we do the window.reload that updates reinstalls and updates the application for the user. This is just a miscellaneous item, not really directly related to service worker use cases. Yeah, so this is what I have Angular service workers point of view. I will publish the slide deck. I will also publish the code repo. You can play with it offline. We can discuss on Twitter if you want to make further improvements, have questions, whatever is the type of exchange we could have.
Well, that was super cool. Well done. Also,
thank you.
Great job fitting all that info in like such a short amount of time. That's the hardest part with lightning talks.
Yeah, hopefully I'm good with the time. I don't know if I went over.
You know what? Since we don't have one of our speakers here, that you're just fine. But honestly, that was pretty good. Anybody have any other questions?
So
I know that you've got you're going to share the slides and some other stuff. We're going to have a recording up eventually. But anybody else have any other questions about PWAs and caching and all of it? Service workers? All right. Well, I don't see anything, but feel free to put your messages in the chat and we'll try to get those shared. I see Daniel has his hand up. Daniel, do you want to be promoted to panelist? You can ask live. Is that what you'd like? Jason's saying that was really awesome as always, Keerti.
Thank you so much.
Oh, we got a question from Vidya. Any applications on web currently using these features? Great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me share my screen again. If you go to Service Worker internals on Google Chrome, you'll see ignore the local host. These are all me playing with it. But if you look at many other web apps, these are few Angular.io. This is our Angular documentation. Gmail, Calendar, Google Docs, Code Sandbox. Yeah, this is SharePoint sites. There are a lot of applications. Somewhere here, there will also be Medium supposed to be there. I've seen Medium as well using the service worker. A lot of applications have adopted service workers off late.
I think more and more apps, as they get farther along, are going to be using it. Offline mode is a really great incentive for our customers. All right, so Daniel has a question. He wants to ask it live, I think. Just going to allow you to talk. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Daniel.
Okay. I was looking for the unmute. How would you go about syncing data in the cache? My use case would be something like I've got some data that I'm updating in the PWA in a disconnected state. Is there some guidelines or advice on how to sync that up with the backend?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's slightly out of what I plan to present today, but this sample does have those examples. If you come here, what I could do is I could go offline and add a comment. So because I throttled it offline, the service is not accessible anymore to the browser. If I try to go to Google on this, it will say page can't be displayed. I'll submit this. So this is the application. You could handle it differently. In the sample, I'm just showing a message saying application is offline. We saved your data temporarily. So we are not using, this sample is not using service worker for it. Service worker is good for get calls, but for any data update, delete, create calls like put, post, and delete, primarily patch even as well. For those things, I prefer to use IndexedDB. IndexedDB is a good use case. You should see once I refresh this database. You should see this test record added here. It's a key value database. So I'll go back. There is a network tab. Yeah, yeah. I'll remove the throttling.
Mm-hmm.
Now the browser identifies that the browser came online, cache the comments back with the service. Now, if I go to the IndexedDB, it is cleaned up there. If I refresh this page, I'll come back. Refresh this page. I'm coming from the service now. You have the data. So this is one way to do it, but yeah, depending on the use case, you could take different approaches. Effectively, what we're doing is save it locally in the browser in a database, IndexedDB, and eventually sync it.
Is that done? Is it basically you have to code that, or is that?
Yeah.
Do you get that for free? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, lot of it is. These APIs there are a couple of options. I played with Dexy, which is easier API, but we still have to code it to answer your question.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Vidya says, an ex-SharePoint developer here.
Jay in Seattle has an older comment that says, great effort on the slides, love the font and the drawings.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the awesome presentation, Keerti. And now we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. So we're going to go straight to Owen because I don't see Mohammed here. but that's okay. There was a little bit of mess up with the Zoom today, so I don't blame it. So
sounds good.
Oh, do you want to introduce yourself, or you want me to do it?
I'll intro myself.
Sounds good, man.
Alrighty. Well, it's great to be here. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to get to speak and hang out on a Tuesday night with other Angular enthusiasts. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about MicroFrontends and module federation. But in the larger context, before I get going, I like to think about like web applications and what we do on the day-to-day. There isn't a single like solution or architecture that we can use for any problem. There isn't a one size fits all. So I'm a big sports fan. Football season, American football just got done. We're about to get into March Madness. So one thing about sports that applies really well, I think, to the job of being a developer is the notion of a playbook. It's often the most successful teams have really deep playbooks, or they might have only a few plays in the playbook, but they know how to execute them really well and when to use them. So we're going to talk just real briefly before we get into module federation about MicroFrontends as a playbook or as a collection of plays in your overall web application playbook. So getting going, kind of already talked about it. The playbook's super important because it really helps you visualize your target, understand the continuous improvement model, and help you know what is needed to achieve the goals and to be successful. And so this is true in sports. It's also true in software. So some of the plays, just as an example, that might be in your playbook, it might be MicroFrontends, it might be mono repos, it might be both. You might be using the Jamstack, you might need SSR, some server-side rendering, you might be doing some WebAssembly. And then you might be looking for some new plays. You might be looking at module federation, or you might be looking to using something like single SPA. So all of these have an application for solving problems for your business. But so before I go forward, to introduce myself, so who is Owen Mecham? First and foremost, I'm a father of 4 daughters. I've been married to my wife a little bit over 20 years. I live in Utah. We enjoy spending time outside, riding bikes, going on trips, spending some time in nature. And in old days, I used to like to ski and do stuff. If I jumped like that now, I would probably break my back. Professionally, I work for a company called ADESA. I'm the technical director of product engineering. We have a number of teams. I'll post my job posting in the chat here as soon as I'm done. We have multiple teams with openings for Angular and .NET developers, from anywhere from kind of mid-level to as high, highly skilled as you can be. We do all of our applications are now built, cloud native in Azure. We do a lot of Angular, a lot of .NET, and a lot of event-driven architectures. And then on the front end side of things, we've been working with MicroFrontends via web components for a number of years, but are looking forward into how we might need to change the plays that we have in our playbook when it comes to how we build applications. So if you're interested in working on a teams that are focused on their products with a strong DevOps culture and mindset towards getting things done, I'd love to hook up with you and talk with you after the meetup. So when I'm not at work, I also enjoy helping out, organizing conferences, whether it's teaching workshops there or just helping on the back end, just get things done. And it's great to be at this meetup with Jason Warner. I worked together with him for probably almost 20 years. So it's great to get a chance to be online with him and share the stage. So all right, jumping back. And I'm going to breeze quickly through these. The slides will be available afterward, but this is to just kind of get your brain thinking and getting focused on MicroFrontend. So MicroFrontend definition, the answer is, it depends on who you ask, right? It's the age-old software question. It depends. So for me, the way I like to define a micro front end is it's a loosely coupled, highly cohesive set of UI components or applications. The reason that we would use a micro front end architecture is to allow a lot of teams to work seamlessly with each other to deliver one, to what an end user looks like as one application, but to really accelerate your ability to deliver code to production many times per day. The apps that you build could be framework version agnostic. Like I just said, they're independently deployable. And, depending on your organization structure and the compliance you have in your country, you may need to have teams that have source code isolation. There's a couple different ways to accomplish that, whether it's separate repos or ownership files in GitHub. And then optionally, you could have tech stack agnosticism, meaning you could have one team that's, building an application in Angular, but, another team that's working in React. And the users of the software that we build don't care what the application is built in, so long as it meets their needs. So a really mature micro front end ecosystem would allow for any or all of these. How did we get here? If we, for those of us that have been around the block a little bit, or maybe this is where you're at currently, and that's fine. There's kind of an evolution that I've found that people get to where you start out with like a big giant monolithic application. And then over time you realize that, well, we might be able to move a little bit faster if we have a front end team and then a back end team and another team that's doing our DevOps and getting our, pipelines built. And then as we get further along the line, we end up with, okay, well, let's do, microservices are now a thing. So let's have one big front end team with a BFF or something in the middle, but a whole bunch of different microservices. And what a lot of people came to the realization of was that teams are really, really effective when they can solve a problem from all the way from the front to the back and go through that cycle over and over. So instead of having like a technology specific team, you have product engineering teams that solve a specific business need from discovery to building the application to capturing data for your product owner to see if their hypothesis was correct and if it's successful. So this is where micro front ends come into play, is it takes all of those different microservices and includes the micro front end or the front end portion of the application as part of your deployed code or your solution. And to the end user that's going to Amazon or Azure DevOps or whichever website's using micro front ends, they just know that when they click on the navigation, they get routed to where they want to do work and everything is fine. But what this allows us to do is when, in this example here, when the checkout team's ready to ship code, they don't have to coordinate with the search team to make sure that the front end code is ready to go. So this just allows for rapid development, which is something that I'm a big fan of. And just a quick note, you may not always have an API or a database on the back end of a micro front end. If you have static content or something, you may be serving something that's just the front end. So I'm going to breeze through this. This will be a blast for the past for Jason, some of the things that he probably wrote some of the code on this for. Let's look at some enterprise use cases for micro front end. So let's say you have a line of business app. This area that's shaded in red might be its own Angular application that's being, in this case, deployed as a web component. And, you'll have a one-time setup where you kind of wire up the application into the navigation of the application shell or the outer portion of the app. But from that point forward, anytime that the team that's working on this pre-sale audit feature needs to deploy something, the user doesn't need to refresh. The next time they come back to the page, they get the latest version of the code. You can also go a step further and make the navigation in your host like fully dynamic so that you don't have to have like a one-time commit, just depending on how robust you're trying to build your application. So your front end of your APIs deploy together. You would typically use this type of a structure if you are within a single bounded context for those of you doing domain-driven design. And what we're trying to do is make sure the user doesn't have to do anything in order to get the latest version of this code. And then the bottom, a micro front end can certainly contain other micro front ends, kind of like Inception, if you've seen that movie. So here's a quick example of that. Let's suppose that this area in red, when I click on that, brings up a component, a web component that has its own APIs and is the master of all of the data that is written back to our database. This could be its own micro front end that's then utilized by any number of applications within your ecosystem. Another option could be that you have a web application where you're using almost like a router as a service or something like Single SPA, where you're bootstrapping an entire application based on the route that you navigate to, and you only pay that cost to bootstrap the application the first time you kind of hit that parent directory that's being monitored. That's an approach that people have used, whether you roll your own or if you decide to use something like Single SPA to accomplish this. And then another approach that's particularly useful if you're doing like modernization of a legacy application, in this case, like an MVC application, and you want to break that up into different domains, you could do micro front ends as a means to an end, where in the process of modernizing this page, you might take one particular area and break it out into its own micro front end that's being delivered. And then all the way through until all of a sudden you strangle out all of the different portions of the app. And then you can have your cutover where you either, maybe it's just an Angular, just a regular old Angular application in NX with a better architecture that you've moved to. But this would allow you to get to that endpoint over time. Kind of skip past these. One thing, if you go with this approach, with having a lot, especially if you're using web components via Angular elements, is you need to watch out for your bundle size. Each of these different areas, the plus to Angular elements is you're going to get this isolated, wrapper around your code, but that means that you're including Angular, RxJS, maybe even Angular material in each one of these individual areas. If you have a kind of a higher degree of communication among your teams, you could use Webpack, some of the capabilities in Webpack and NGX Build Plus to actually create an extension of your Webpack configuration that exports out all of your dependencies to external packages so that you could load those once by the shell, and then you just have one kind of shared version of Angular or RxJS on the page. But that increases, the coupling that you have and the dependencies between apps. But if you're doing this as a short-term means to get to a more modernized application, you could certainly consider that. This is just a real quick one. Always ask, should you use a micro front-end architecture? There's a great article from Manfred on his blog that talks through this decision tree. Check it out. Because it's not always the right tool, right? So just make sure that you're choosing the right architecture for your solution, and don't try to make everything fit into the same architecture. Okay, so just to kind of lay the groundwork, the application shell, or in module federation world, we often call this the host. What are the responsibilities of the host? That if you looked at any micro front end, what are some of the common characteristics that you'd see? Well, you'd see that your host is likely in charge of authentication, or it's at least using some shared libraries or packages. It could be Angular interceptors. It could be some additional auth utilities that are part of an NPM package. It's going to be in charge of your navigation. So really be careful to think about your router strategy and how you're going to structure the app. Notifications and error handling are a big one. If you have 12 teams working on one single web page, you don't want to have 12 different ways to communicate success or failure to your end user. So broadcasting those events up to the host application and letting the UI be a concern that's delegated to that app is something that is a best practice. Same thing with your kind of application metrics tracking, whether it's Google Analytics, App Insights. Your support team is going to want to have one place to look for all of these different things when it comes to being able to troubleshoot issues in the field. Locales, if you have to deal with multilingual sites, something that could be, maintained, that state maintained by the host, so that you don't have English in one version and then French when you navigate to another page. And then event and command-based messaging as something to consider as you build out your architecture. Okay, so these are just the title slides. In courses that I've taught on this, we would dig into each one of these areas, but I wanted to at least highlight them as something to consider, like as you're writing down notes of things that you want to have a solid plan for before you move forward. So how you're going to communicate from micro front end to micro front end, or if you should at all. If you're going to take more of a kind of Redux type approach of communicating up to the host and letting the host broadcast or broadcast events that other people can subscribe to. State management, how much state to share or to share any at all is something you need to talk through. If you're using Angular elements or even Angular with module federation, understanding how NGX Build Plus works is something to dig into. Similar to the previous talk and talking about the strategies of how to load data in PWAs, whether you're optimizing for performance or just depending on the needs of your application, how you load the micro front end, whether you load the code each time or whether you're okay with an older version of the application and waiting for it to kind of update in the background before it gets loaded is something to think through. And then component libraries, whether you're doing something like Storybook and how you're going to manage kind of some of the shared components across applications. And then enterprise delivery. So CI/CD, localization, unit testing, hosting, all of those things, like how can you optimize your ability to go from idea all the way to delivered product that's providing business value. So micro front ends are something that fit really well into optimizing for strong enterprise delivery. So we'll go ahead. I'm going to do just a couple of short, kind of the simple demos to get our feet wet and kind of introduce how module federation could be used as a micro front end approach that could be part of your tool belt. So this was all made possible with the changes in Webpack 5. Really thankful to Zach Jackson on the team for putting a lot of thought into making this possible. So if you don't follow him on Twitter, definitely give him a follow. He has got some great content there in this space. So to show why you would want to consider module federation and kind of how that changes the game and for micro front ends, we'll look at this same application that we looked at before, a line of business application that's currently using web components. And I've highlighted here in red the portion of this UI that is the host code, or what people have called, the app shell. So the navigation, the universal kind of search, and maybe your title bar, this is all loaded up front. And this application, if we write it in Angular, it's going to have, Angular core, common, router, and any number of additional, dependencies bundled up in that application. And then the part in green here is just the code that it took to write this. Well, when we load this area in the middle, if we load like a remote, if we're using a web component, that's great, but it also has, if you see here, we've got Angular core, Angular common, Angular router in there as well. So depending on, the connection speed or the processing power of the browser that's being used, if it's mobile, we're all of a sudden doing a lot of heavy lifting, a lot more data over the wire to make our application work. So wouldn't it be great if, instead of having to, also bundle up all of those dependencies, if you could deploy just your micro front end and let Webpack at runtime decide, hey, is there a version of Angular core, common, and router that's compatible with the code that I wrote? If there is, let's just use that. And I don't even have to download it or, do anything else, and just let just let Webpack wire that all up and let it work. That's like a real game changer when it comes to micro front ends, because we get rid of this problem of having a whole bunch of micro front ends on the same page with different dependencies. And so we'll walk through some of the use cases for how you might be able to do, use this at your job. So the way this is really all glued is it all comes down to some additional changes or some extensions of your Webpack configuration. So you will have in the simplest architecture using module federation, you'll have a single host. And then you'll have, X number of remotes. And each one of those remotes represents, a micro front end or a different component. It could be a full micro front end or could be a single component. And these are all managed with some configuration. So let's go ahead and show kind of how this works and how this is all glued together. So the remote is going to load on demand. So we don't even want to load the code that's required to, for your component or your module to work until the user requests it. So it's just a just-in-time download, at least by default. And then you can choose whether or not you're going to expose like an entire Angular module or a single component as a JavaScript module that Webpack knows how to talk to and bootstrap. And then all of the dependencies are resolved at runtime. So you might have, if your host is using version, 12.x of Angular, but your micro front end is requiring a version 13.x of Angular, Webpack's going to say, hey, there isn't already a version 13 of Angular here. Let's go ahead and pull that dependency down and store it in this registry and hook that up with this micro front end that comes in. And then if another micro front end comes in later and says, hey, I also need version 13, well, it doesn't have to download and wire that up again. It can just use the version that's already available. So here's two examples. There's a couple of different files here, at least portions of those files. So on the left, we have the host Webpack configuration or a part of it. On the right, we have the configuration for a remote. And then at the bottom left, we have a sample route that would live inside your host application. So I'm going to highlight some of the areas that link this stuff all together. So as we move forward, the host is going to have a collection of remotes. So it needs to know what are all of the sources where I can go grab components or modules from. And so you'll configure that, in a simplest example, this will be a static configuration, although you can certainly do it dynamically as well. But it will have, whether static or dynamic, ultimately when the application runs, it's going to have a list of all of the remotes. And if you see that MFE1 that's highlighted everywhere on the left, that's saying, hey, here's, I'm looking for a module MFE1. On the right, on the remote, we're saying, hey, I am MFE1. This is my name. So that those two things need to match. And then if you look down in the host routes, the first part of your route is going to match that MFE1. As we move forward, we then have the file name. So part of the path in the host configuration says, hey, here's this file and it's named as remote entry.js. That needs to match what we're actually exposing or the name of the file in our remote. Each remote could have a different file name. It could have the same, but when you wire these things up, they need to match. So that's a common area that people could get tripped up, at least at the beginning. The next is what you choose to expose or how you choose to expose it within your remote. So on the right side, if you see exposes and then / module, that's just saying, hey, I'm going to share, at MFE1 / module, I'm going to share, and then this path, that's the path to the this example, a cryptos module. And then down in the route, those two things paired together in the host application can then at runtime resolve to the module that's being exposed by the remote. And then the final thing is, when we do this this dynamic import of our routes, the module that we are that we have down in the bottom in the host routes obviously needs to be what is exposed at /module in our remote Webpack config. So this is all of the things that you need to double check as you're kind of playing around with this to glue this all together. And we'll show an example here in just a second. I'm going to skip this portion other than just read how these dependencies, how Webpack determines which versions are good or compatible versions. It's going to use semantic versioning. So you can read through this either on Webpack, Webpack's documentation, or if you're using Angular, you can read it at the Module Federation Angular plugin documentation that I'll share as well. And then finally, like where this can all go, and there's some great examples for this in React. I'd love to get one working in Angular. I just have not done it yet. Is the notion of an omnidirectional host, meaning, this is great that you can have a host that then controls all of these other remotes. But what if I'm working on the remote and I want to be able to just, as I'm developing that code, let it treat the host application and all of the other remotes as remotes, so that no matter who's developing the application, no matter which repo you're in, when you ng-serve that application, it's going to load all of the other applications that correspond in the environment that you're in, and so that you're always actually working in an actual like fully blown application that your end user would see, so that you're not waiting until you deploy the app to see how everything integrates together, or waiting until you get to your next environment. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the slides here and jump to some code. So I've got just a small sample application running. I'll show a portion of that here. Let's get to the right window. Super basic Angular material application, localhost 5000. It's ng fake coin. So right now, if I go to search for cryptos, I get market closed, try back a little bit later. I haven't done any of the work here to wire up a remote to this host. So we're going to go through and do that together here real quick to see what that is like. Just do a quick time check. I'll probably go through just the first portion of this. Let's see. Back to go ahead and cancel here. So I've got two different terminals here. I'll be working in either of them. To just one, I'll do kind of our commands in the shell, and another one for the remote, just as we go forward. So I'll show the code later while it's building, so we can do that while, so I don't waste some time here. So what we're going to do, if we want to actually wire up and create this configuration so that we can add module federation to this application, we're going to use this command. We're going to do an ng add, and then we're using this package, that Angular-architects module federation. The sample's on Angular 12 right now, so I'm going to use the specific version. There are some nuances when you use version 13. Telling it that it is going to apply this to the shell project, and I'm going to configure it for port 5000. So I'll go ahead and get that running. And then I'm going to grab a similar command, and let's see. I'm going to go and say, yes, I want to proceed. I'll go ahead and install that. And what this is doing in the background, actually, let's open up the code here. If we open up the source here, let's see. We've got a couple of projects inside this monorepo. For this example, I've got both of these projects living in the same monorepo. They could certainly live in completely separate repositories. You would just wire it up in your configuration to point to the right URL to get the assets. So let's see. Just check where I'm at up to date with origin main. I'm wondering if we're going to just roll with this. And if this doesn't work, we'll just blame it on my prep beforehand. So what I want to show is we just added, oh, here we go. Our changes finally came through. Let's go ahead and open up the Webpack config for the shell. And we're not going to go through all of this. I'm going to just highlight the areas that I brought up in the slides. If you can see, all of this boilerplate is added by the plugin, and it adds a new section for a new federation or module federation plugin. And it gives us a sample for both a remote or a host. So I'm going to get this going for the remote as well, and then talk through the rest so that this is working in the background while so I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to specify the project, the MFE1. That's going to be one of the remote modules, and we're going to configure that for port 3000. So I'll get that going while we look back at the rest of this here. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and this is in the shell project. So that means it's going to be the host. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of all of the configuration here for the remote and uncomment the section for remotes. You can see here, I'm going to leave it with the default of MFE1, but I did change the port 3000 when I just ran the command. So I'm going to change that 4200 to 3000. So this is all I have to do on the host side of things to get things wired up to say, hey, here's your remote, here's where to get it. If you notice, though, the application that I had is using more than just core, common, and router. I also have Angular material in the mix. So I'm gonna paste in more of these dependencies. Let's see, here we go. So we'll go ahead and we'll add 6 more dependencies here for material, and we'll call that good. This is also in the documentation, but the most basic setup that it's going to give you out of the gate. With singleton true, Webpack's going to make sure that it only registers a single instance of that module at runtime. Strict version being set to true means that if you don't have like a compatible match, it's going to load another version of it. So this coupled with singleton work together to determine how many different instances of a module you can have running at runtime. And then the required version, you could use semantic syntax or semantic versioning syntax here. If you choose auto, it's going to just look at the package.json versions that you have specified in your application and use that to determine the appropriate like shared version of the component or of the module that you want to use. So we've got this one done. Let's take a peek at our, okay, so we've got everything added then also for the remote. So let's open that up. It's right here. So this is the Webpack config inside of MFE1. I'm going to go ahead and this is a remote. So let's nuke the section for hosts. Let's paste in the same set of dependencies. So if we have, let's say that I added an additional dependency here that wasn't in the host, that's totally fine. It just means that because Webpack wouldn't recognize that we have that dependency loaded by the host, it's going to go ahead and take care of adding it as soon as this component or this remote loads. So your behavior that you have at runtime is going to vary depending on how you choose to and what you choose to share. So I'll go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to uncomment this section here. We'll keep it named at MFE1. We're going to keep the default name of remote entry.js. We left that the same. I'm going to change this a little bit instead of like just to keep it saying I'm going to share the whole module and source app. If I can spell cryptos, and then it's the cryptos module .ts. So I'm going to go ahead and this remote's going to share our cryptos module out. So I'm going to go ahead and make that, save that. There's two more things we need to change. So we have these two different configurations now set. We've identified the dependencies that we want to share, but we need to actually wire this up in the host application. So I'm going to open up the app routes in the shell, and we've got a section here that I'm going to uncomment and go ahead and add a path for cryptos. And that's going to go ahead and do, it's going to import from mfe1/module, and then it's going to load the cryptos module, the routes from the cryptos module. But you'll see here, I've got like a problem because TypeScript's complaining. It's like, hey, I don't know anything about mfe1/module. And that's because this isn't a thing until runtime, until Webpack says, hey, here's this mfe1/module that you can use. So the way to get around that is to go ahead and open up, or to just create a declaration file. And all this is going to do is just make TypeScript happy and just do a simple declaration saying, hey, I know about this thing. Don't worry about it. So if we come back to the app routes now, we should be good. So let's go ahead and just from this point, I'm going to fire up the MFE1. Give that a second to go. And you can see here that's going to open that up on port 3000. Let's see a couple other considerations while we're running low on time while this first part gets started. If we'd had, if we were to dive deeper into this, what I would show is beyond just the demo that we'll see in a second, where we can, stream, code in and share dependencies and resolve that all at runtime. We can also have singleton instances of libraries that we use between applications for state management. We could, if you wanted to, have a shared instance of the NGRX store or whatever other state store that you have that you want to share in between, and Webpack will take care of that. And you could also, even though I'm sharing a module here, you could do this to dynamically add components, almost like a plugin type architecture, and stream those components from, say, your component library if you expose them out at, as a JavaScript module. So let's see, this one should be almost done. Let me fire up start the shell on this one. Okay, so that should open up here in a second. Okay, so let's close this guy. It should open up here as well. So the shell's almost loaded here. Sharing your screen on Zoom is a great way to do kind of performance metrics too. It'll automatically chew up 40% of your processing power. Okay, so this should fire up. We've got the application now loaded. I'm going to go ahead and inspect this. So to just to wrap up here, I'm going to go to the network tab, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. So what we'll see with this is it's going to look a little bit different if you look at this normally. So our main JS is going to have if you see, I don't know if that's too small, I can zoom in on it if we need to. Let's see. Let's go into here. So this main JS, this is being served up from port 5000. It's got all of the Webpack configuration. If we were to look into here, this knows everything about what the hosts are and what the remotes are. And so once it knows what all of the remotes are, it's going to fire off a request to get the remote entry.js for all of the remote entries in that collection. So if you look here, this file is actually, this manifest is actually being served up from localhost 3000. So if I were to click into here, like some of the pertinent things are, you can see it's declaring this MFE1 that we have in our configuration. And towards the top, we have this module map that defines, hey, I'm sharing ./module, and go ahead and share that as this cryptos module TS. And then the actual source code, we'll go ahead and show that later. And then what we have after it knows all of the remotes, it's going to have this actually load the source for the shell application. That's what everything in here is. And then if you look, we've got this whole list. I'm going to make that a little smaller. We've got this list of the dependencies. We've got our material button, Angular common, the material icon, the side nav, the router, everything that after the application went through tree shaking that is known that it needs of its dependencies were all loaded so that the application could go ahead and run. So now if I go ahead and I click on cryptos, before it didn't do anything, now it should go ahead. If we watch the network tab as we do this, you can see we got 2 additional dependencies that loaded as soon as I, interacted with that component. And that's because Webpack knew that, hey, as soon as you go ahead and pull down this MFE1 and anything from it, it needs to have the material card and the material input. So we've got the input here, and then you've got the, the mat card. So, but what you notice didn't happen is I didn't have to load all of this other Angular at the same time. So we can resolve all of this at runtime and then just pull down, in this case, you can almost ignore all of the sizes of these because this is in development mode. If we go to production configuration, all of these names just end up turning into numbers that are really hard to follow through and see what's what. The production size of this art application's like a couple dozen kilobytes instead of 600 in this case. But if you were doing like all of this as a web component, you would end up loading like a 1 megabyte web component for just a simple little material card that displays something. So I'm at time. I've used actually more time than I was allotted, but this shows you, if you follow me at Owen Mecham on Twitter, or you can find me on GitHub. I'll upload this repo and this presentation, or at least this version of it. You can take a peek and you can hit me up. There's some additional examples in there too. So I just hope we can connect after this, and I'll go ahead and right now and actually post the job posting if you'd like to come work with us and build things like this. So I'll turn it to Jason or Eric, who's moderating out, to do any kind of questions or anything there. So.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. Great job there, Owen. That was fantastic as always. He has a great workshop that he often does for ng-conf, and it gets better every time he does it. So you're always adding to that. So if folks want to also learn more from Owen, look for workshops that he does at conferences. So first question I'm going to read out of the Q&A is by Jeffrey. He says, is it expected that Angular will support this? I'm not sure what this is, so provide me with context, Jeffrey, if you're still around. Will support this directly / built in any of the next few versions?
So I'll take a stab at what that means. Whether it's, MicroFrontends or module federation. You clarified MicroFrontends. So now I don't think that it would rule out Webpack here, but probably, I think in last August, Minko on the Angular team threw a tweet out and asked for input from the community at Broad, saying, hey, if you're interested in MicroFrontends and want to be a part of how MicroFrontends and Angular and the CLI could be better, please reach out. So I jumped on that, and I was one of a number of, he probably interviewed 50 people from all over the world and took a bunch of input. I don't know what the outcome from those discussions will be, but I do know that the discussion of to what degree should Angular standardize some of the kind of the setup for MicroFrontends is at least under consideration. He devoted a number of weeks to doing those interviews. So I would expect we could see something in the future from the Angular team on this.
Very cool. We have another question from Mateo. Can we have an advanced technique to map the micro-frontend aliases in a central place for easy maintenance or nope?
Or nope. I like that last part. I'm going to start using that at the end of my questions. Yes. So I did not show in this. Instead of having like static, configurations that you have to hard code into the application, you can imagine if you had like 50 different remotes, you wouldn't want to redeploy the application every time you want to add a new remote. So you can use what's called dynamic federation. And one of the things I didn't show in this is there's an extra step that doing module federation does to your Angular application. It takes your main.js that normally does the bootstrap step. It moves that into a bootstrap.ts file that is dynamically then imported when the application starts. And what that does is it gives Webpack an opportunity to go through and figure out if all of the dependencies for all of the remotes and the hosts line up, or to create basically this master list. Because it does that, what you can do is you can inject a process into that phase that goes out and actually adds to the configuration of your remotes at runtime. So let's say you had an API that returned a list of all of the remotes that the application should use. You could hit that and have all of these things happen dynamically. So I think that would be your advanced technique instead of the nope. There are some examples of that, like a great spot to look at, not just for Angular, but all of the different module federation in that link I just threw in the Zoom chat. There's a ton of samples here on how to do module federation in almost any different type of framework, different versions. Check that out. I go through here a lot to kind of just see what the best practices are from the folks that write this. So definitely start following this repo and contribute if you can.
Thank you. We have another question from Rogelio Flores. He says, is there a strategy or tooling that you know of to centralize I18N? Let's say so that you only have 8 I18N strings on one repo / micro-frontend.
I have a strong opinion of how to do this. This is something that both me and Jason had to work on at our last company, but there's a really cool tool. It goes beyond just having like a file, because you could certainly have one string or one remote that's just returning back, a JSON list of strings. You could do that today with even just an Angular service that returns it back. Like if you use Transloco, it can pull those things at runtime. But if you want to actually create a process where you're not waiting for someone to actually go do all those translations, and you want to automate that into your build pipeline, if you do something like, GitHub Actions or, inject something into your build steps, if you're using something like Azure DevOps, Jenkins, whatever, you can create, if you use a tool like PO Editor, PO Editor lets users go in and add all of the different translations for the strings that you have in any of your applications, any number of applications. You can hit those API endpoints and actually have it write back to your repo during the build, so that you're continuously getting the latest version of those strings. And then every time, so if you're doing, some continuous delivery where you're deploying an app a couple times a week or a couple times a day, you're constantly improving your I18N. So I'd be happy if you want more details on how we've done that. Hit me up on Twitter, message me or whatever, and I'd be happy to chat more about it.